Hello everyone, today we talk about the Hellenistic light infantry, the so-called Psiloi or Gymnetes. So etymologically speaking, Psiloi means, I think something like bare, stripped, and Gymnetes, the naked ones essentially, um, which gives really the idea of the light character of these troops. I only recently started to make videos about Hellenic and Hellenistic warfare, and I will surely more in the future, together with every kind of warfare, essentially from the Bronze Age to the 30 Years' War. And I think it's important to discuss Hellenic and Hellenistic warfare because although these have risen in a certain sense to attention in popular culture, I think especially through video gaming largely, for what I've seen. Every time you Google some of these ancient warfare name, and it pops up something from a video game. So that probably means there is an interest in such topics. But at the same time, there is still a bit of a confusion. First of all, I might have done a video now about Hellenic, that is classical light infantry. This is about Hellenistic light infantry, so this is chiefly from the times of the rise of Macedon onwards, which still includes Greece, meant as the Hellenic motherland, let's say, but that looks at a broader picture, that is essentially the whole Hellenistic world. So not just Alexander and Macedon and Alexander's successors, but also those broadly meant Hellenistic powers that maybe had properly nothing to do with with anyone coming from Greece or the Greek colonies. Take Pontus or other. Let's say everywhere it was written Psiloi or Gymnetes in the sources, from Greek authors too, because we have to consider this as well. And I don't want to make a much of a terminological premise, but I think it's important still to bear in mind that and I see that part of the mistakes that are done in considering these troops is kind of letting them fit in a sort of factional belonging. While most of the terms we use in ancient warfare are actually pretty loose. I mean, they can fit to many types of troops, also because the history that we know of that time was essentially written either in Greek or in Latin later. So every kind of people that was out there, unless it wasn't something, I don't know, from Persia, from the Near East, but take, for instance, the whole European world, didn't write, or at least it wrote in a way that substantially doesn't tell us much about such things. So you can find that, I don't know, the term phalanx is attributed by the Greeks even to the Celts, for instance, even if the Celtic infantry wasn't really a phalanx like we mean it today in a sort of categorical sense with a certain specific characteristics, whether it was the classical Hoplitic one or the Hellenistic Macedonian one. So there is a lot of misunderstanding, especially about among those people who have never actually thought about these differences and just approach these topics from the internet or from wherever media that is supposed to explain it to them. So today maybe I will make a bit of this, but generally speaking, be cautious about this. A first distinction that is important to do is that the Psiloi or Gymnetes, for the sake of grammar we will use essentially Psiloi, weren't really just javelinmen. They could define even it's a term that can define even archers or slingers. There was essentially a the Hellenistic world was pretty wide. So as you can imagine, there were substantial differences also in the variety of these psiloi um, capabilities. But another of excuse me, I drink a little. Another of the mistakes you don't have to fall into is that finding a Greek name like Psiloi, you have to think that these were sort of sort of a regular force that somehow was attached to the either Hellenic or Hellenist, let's say Macedonian bulk mm, of settlers, of people that, generally speaking, had come from this Greek-speaking area of the Balkans, because these were largely foreign troops, especially from a certain point onwards. Some of them were practically mercenaries, others were instead probably put together also from, I can't say it's a circumscriptional base, but they could have a very diverse origin, both socially and ethnically speaking. Obviously, well, socially, probably not so much, because these were extremely light infantry. Surely there weren't aristocrats in them. But what I mean is that they could be either local peasantry or simply, I don't know, mountaineers or people who came from other places. So they could have a very different extraction. And depending on the power that we're discussing, they also varied in specialty, as in Greece especially, as well as in Macedon and the surrounding territories, the Psiloi were usually javelin men, or preferably javelin men. It's not that archers or slingers lacked in their ranks, but similarly they were prevalently javelin men. And it seems, however, instead that in the Seleucid Empire, as well as other Eastern powers, fielded also many archers. This is the idea that the East was more characterized by archery in a certain sense. I personally think that, honestly, even in the East, the majority of Psiloi were in fact javelin men, not really archers or slingers, simply because archers and slingers are really, especially, I mean, they can definitely be recruited easily, but they have um, sometimes maybe a greater level of specialization in a certain sense. So having scattered slingers and archers among the Psiloi was definitely normal, but say that archers and slingers, doesn't matter how effective they are in terms of experience, specialization, and all, but they still are probably more precious than anyone that can launch a javelin without um, too many difficulties. Slinging and archering was pretty common in the ancient world among lots of populations, but let's say the broader numbers of people who could use a weapon were definitely the javeliners. In many ways, also because the majority of warriors in the ancient world, and when I say warriors, I don't mean fighter. I mean something opposed to soldiers, essentially, as especially from a social extraction, were also javeliners. Take, I don't know, think about the Italics, think about the Iberians, think about the Celts, the Germans. They were all javeliners in some measure. Even if they were melee infantry, they all had their own throwing javelins. They're throwing spears, actually, because the javelin in that sense was also quite difficultly distinguishable from a stopping spear in certain occasions. Then obviously there were certain extremes to this, for which there is a javelin that is evidently a javelin, because it definitely has it's specialized in this throwing weapon characteristics. Other spears that evidently were not thrown, or at least could be thrown, but they weren't particularly shaped or fitting the category of javelins. But the broader let's say, sort of spear was normally, on average, also a throwing weapon of some sort. And the Psiloi weren't warriors, however. Usually, I mean, they weren't. Some were. Like if you recruited javeliners from Thrace, those were usually recruited from a tribal environment and all. While in the Greek world, these were usually either slaves or at least extremely poor people who kind of had followed anyhow um, all the armies that had ever been fielded, historically speaking. I mean, light infantry is something you find invariably in the whole ancient world as a fighting force. Doesn't matter which army, which people, which civilization we're talking about. Next to the cavalrymen, to the infantrymen, and all, there were always crowds of light infantry that, in this sense, specialized with very into. I mean, they weren't really specialized because they weren't professionals as such. Even if at this time in Hellenistic warfare, there is a sort of increase also in professionalism, broadly speaking, among all the troops, but they were essentially very low status, and they used these poor weapons, in fact, like the javelin, the sling, the bow, and that kind of supported the main body of the army. And we will see, however, how in Hellenistic times light infantry grew extremely important from a tactical point of view. Arguably, it had always been important, even in classical hoplite warfare. They didn't obviously reverse the outcome of battles, but they were definitely useful in softening up the enemy phalanx, even if the classical Hellenic sources want to give the impression that it was all about phalanx clashing, because that was the citizen idea. You know, the idea that the battle was won by bodies of citizens, not by the slaves who ran around the phalanxes and hitting sneakily and also in a disloyal way. But in Hellenistic times, where mercenarism rises, professionalism rises, and especially the Hellenic and now Hellenistic armies are, let's say, deployed and out on campaign for long times on very different and often difficult terrains. This infantry was vital in many ways in most tactical situations, actually. So the characteristics of light infantry are, broadly speaking, always the same. We find Askepiodotos that states that basically their organization was on files of 8, like actually this seems to reflect the phalanx, how the phalanx ranks it actually was. But and this in open order, especially relatively to the Psiloi, but in my opinion, these guys probably might have not had any form of array at all. I mean, they were running around the ranks, often even mixed passing through the various bodies of the phalanx and running up. And so this kind of idea, they had to have 8 ranks deep. It's it's really very abstract, in my opinion. And however, the fact that there is a source who states this still means that probably in the ideal deployment of armies, these Psiloi had to be organized in such a depth. I don't know how much functionally relatively to the actual throwing of the weapons, because actually these troops were probably more effective when they all threw this at once. And the closer they were, the better it was. But probably the idea of having this depth, and especially in open order, might have actually served to form, let's say, a greater distance between the first ranks of this of the skirmishers and the first ranks of the phalanx, so that the enemy assault, whichever it was, had to basically slow down, and to essentially have a longer time of march under fire, or at least a longer time to deal with the skirmishers first before reaching physically to the first ranks of the enemy phalanx. And you obviously understand that this happened also from the other side. So this translated itself in practice into the practice of warfare in very long and often inconclusive skirmishes between the two ranks of the Psiloi, essentially, that was essentially even a way to wait a bit before the battle began, to actually maybe spend the time looking at each other armies and spotting the weak sections of the line, and something like that. But it was normal in any ancient army to the main combat, the melee of the two body of infantry, to be preceded by these long skirmishes. But as we will see, the Psiloi tactical employment has been actually much more dynamic, and surely deserves a lot more of credit, especially because, and this is obvious, today we will see chiefly the employment of Psiloi in, can say, open ground battles, but generally speaking also in how they could be effectively used in open field. But it goes without saying that this light infantry was the best to carry out those operations that were really, especially during the march, as explorers, as helping in cleaning up the path for the main army for the army to march in it, looking at baggage train and skirmishing with other skirmishers, so paving the road in practice to the main army. So these were also expendables. They were extremely cheap. It wasn't a big deal if they got killed in number, but usually because you could replenish them quite easily. Normally, there were lots of people joining these armies, even along the road, along the march, maybe in the same invaded territory, because they hoped maybe to loot. These were also they were, as we've said, very poor people that generally had a taste for looting and stuff like that. So were actually pretty scoundrels in many ways. And so the idea is and the idea is also that their formations were, as we've said, very flexible, not rigid at all. They perfectly adapted to the terrain, whichever it was, and especially if they were already populations that maybe were drawn locally from, because maybe the Greek slave that participated here wasn't greatly skilled into warfare in the first place. A Thracian Psiloi was probably very, very skilled in in to fight on very rough terrain, stuff like that. And definitely screening the frontage of the phalanx was also a very effective way to employ them. So we said they were chiefly skirmishers, deployed in front of the phalanx, at times actually falling back. This was done, we think, in pretty dynamic ways. We know that in many occasions, I remember, I think at the Battle of the Thermopylae between the Seleucids and the Romans, if I'm not wrong, there is an episode in which Polybius states that the Seleucid phalanx opened the ranks to make I don't remember where they were, Psiloi, or I mean they were surely light infantry of some kind, to let them fall back into the ranks and then close in again. This was seemingly normal business. Even the Romans had the so-called Velites that did essentially the same, although the Velites were Roman citizens, so even the different, there was some difference, at least in terms of military organization, but they were essentially the same thing. This idea of falling back behind the phalanx is definitely something logical. I mean, it doesn't even require an explanation. They couldn't stand hand-to-hand combat in practice, and they were better spared, let's say, even if they were cheap for skirmishing from behind the phalanx ranks. The Askepiodotos, always about him, suggests that they could shoot overhead behind a deep, an 8 deep phalanx. So this is actually also seen in certain battles where maybe the phalanx depth is not specified, but we have extensive evidence of this happening, shooting overhead. And this is something that was advised by Xenophon in the Cyropaedia as well. So this was an old practice and not really proper to Hellenic warfare. I mean, it's something you do essentially with all armies at the time. But this also gives you the tactical dynamism that existed, and even the synergy that between the phalanx and the light infantry. There are other authors like Onasander that instead says the contrary, that is essentially the best way to use the Psiloi would be to deploy them in the front because they can see the target firstly. They can run before shooting the javelin, so giving more strength to the throw. And the archers among them can shoot at a lower trajectory, so impressing more force to the arrow. So this doesn't have to be interpreted in oppositive terms. Like, it's obvious that there are certain situations in which you can with ease deploy the troops in the front, and managing to shoot more effectively at the enemy, which is pretty obvious for the aforementioned reasons. But in certain moments, you surely can't, and especially when the two enemy phalanxes are clashing, it's obvious that the respective javeliners from the behind have. First of all, they can't do flanking maneuvering, so that is also a pretty effective way to eventually attack the phalanx. But even shooting overhead, which is risky by the way, because there was definitely some friendly fire involved, but it can be still very effective. because you're fighting. Obviously, the bullets do not arrive on the guys in the very first ranks. They're passing with a more markedly parabolical trajectory over probably the guys either in the mid, on the back of the line, or even behind the same phalanx. Maybe these javeliners ended up for hitting each other at a distance, but even in there is a great distance that has to be covered. So even the range, especially of javelins, is not infinite. You can achieve pretty long distances, but sometimes you also have to think of how convenient it was really even wasting javelins, because even javelins were not infinite quantitatively speaking. So if you wanted to use them properly, these weren't inexhaustible resources, and probably they were of better use when actually thrown at a decent at a decent range with a certain degree of success in terms of target hitting and damage. But there were definitely certain chaotic moments of the battle into which, first of all, these same guys could join, even in very desperate situations, I guess, but probably so desperate that everybody was fleeing, so probably didn't happen that often. But definitely the idea is that these troops were still capable just of throwing all they had, maybe what was left out of the initial skirmishes during the clash of the two phalanxes, just in the midst, sensing that it would hit the enemy lines and seeing how it is. Also because usually battles lasted a lot, but the actual moments of the melee were usually pretty short, and there were intervals between the clashes, so there were actually very few moments into which even this javelin throwing could be effective against the main phalanx for hitting the guys that were at that time engaged into the enemy with the same friendly phalanx of the Psiloi. So there is also another important factor to consider relatively to their employment. That is the difference in height that actually quite often happens even in open ground, in the sense that you can't shoot up or at hill. And this was done extensively. There are many evidence of many evidence of this. Take the Cretan dozens Cretans at the Battle of Sellasia, while they were attacking the Spartans that were deployed over Mount Ewas. There was the phalanx, main body of the phalanx advancing, and the Macedonian phalanx advancing, and the Psiloi actually shooting at even in uphill. So this is interesting because obviously the greater effect can be achieved, if anything, from someone who stands up, so exploiting gravity and giving actually a greater effectiveness to the javelin damaging capabilities. But these javelins were pretty effective even also shooting uphill. So they were very, and this probably also involved archers and slingers, so even weapons that have missile weapons that have a greater range. So that even especially the closed instances, there is not, I mean, you still lose part of the energy having to win gravity to go the other direction, but it still can be very effective to support an assault, like into this case. And there is evidence of also in other times of Hellenic and Hellenistic warfare troops that were drawn up somewhere maybe in a hopeless situation uphill, and they were targeted by the skirmishers that were downwards. And especially if you had to run out of skirmishers yourself, this could be extremely difficult, because basically you had to stay there to be attacked. Especially if you were a heavy hoplite that couldn't definitely run after these light infantrymen. Um, so the Psiloi were usually deployed on the wings, where they could be more maneuverable. This actually happened quite often, even with other types of troops that were lighter. Think about the Thermopylae that I will definitely discuss, because there is also a lot of inaccuracies I've found here and there relatively to who were the Thermopylae and who were instead the other skirmishers, because they're not really the same thing, or at least sometimes Thermopylae could vary in quality, up to saying that some of them were Psiloi. It could be even confused by sources in this sense, terminologically speaking. But they're still two very different things. Just saying that lighter infantry was better, especially in Hellenistic warfare, took over the sides of the phalanx, because there was an elastic defense to be that could be carried out. There could be the chance even of outflanking the enemy. So if you were able to destroy the units that were deployed on the flanks of the enemy as well, so you could get around. At that point the phalanx broke, usually, even before trying to put up a fight. So these were actually precious troops in some situations, and as we will see, they made actually a good they were put at good use on many occasions, and especially the high ground was preferred to shoot from, as we were saying. As we were also saying, the skirmishing was usually preliminary to the clash of phalanxes. I mean, these javeliners were definitely effective even against phalanxes, but they couldn't win they couldn't win battles by themselves, and even this flanking unit, etc. They were rarely, however, a decisive factor into battles. The bulk was about chiefly the heavy infantry, and then especially cavalry maneuvering, and among this anvil and hammer, definitely these lighter troops got smashed. It's simply that they had a support effectiveness that could really add to the attrition factor, let's say, that happened during the battles, so that maybe you still needed your phalanx to win a battle, especially an open battle. But if the odds were pretty heavily matched, maybe the casualties inflicted by the skirmishers were in practice maybe could make the difference in this sense. So they could determine the victory, but they weren't a decisive factor out there. Otherwise there would have been only light infantry armies, and obviously so it wasn't. So they were important, but you still have to be capable of evaluating them for what they practically were. So usually in Greece, at least, as we've said, it was the poorer people that, just like in other populations, etc., but in the more urbanized and civilized areas, Psiloi kind of lacked, because even slaves belonged to someone, and this someone wasn't maybe that happy to send them to fight. Obviously, the whole situation was a bit more flexible, and you know, it really depends on the social organization and all. But usually in the Greek motherland, the Psiloi had originated especially from those poorer hill peoples that relied on skirmishing just even for a living, as hunters and even as thieves and and brigands, because this is also the reality, crude reality of society at the time. And they could be pretty effective in during the Celtic invasion of Greece of 279 BC. At the Battle of the Thermopylae, the Galatians were suffered very heavy casualties, seemingly just thanks to the Aetolian and Phocian javelin men. So in that occasion, you see that on a mountainous terrain, the effectiveness of the Psiloi was increased. Here there would be to open a very powerful digression relatively to the how really skirmishers had changed already at that point. The Hellenic warfare, not just the Hellenistic one, because the Hellenistic world in this sense had always known the use of skirmishers. It was really what happened in Greece that increased the importance of javeliners, given the Greek the nature of the Greek grounds, especially in mountain passes and all, where let's say a bunch of skirmishers could really wipe out entire formations of hoplites that in those narrow passes couldn't deploy in the usual politic formation, and therefore were pretty much exposed to javelin fire from all directions that could wipe them out. The nightmare of classical hoplites had always been the mountain pass, because on there they were perfectly vulnerable. And the two Realphoroi were born, by the way, since we mentioned them before, exactly for this reason. So in the case of the Galatians were this Celtic people that invaded Greece. So in that case, but they weren't excessively different in substance than other heavy infantries in practice. Yeah, sure, they were lighter on average, lightly armored, but that's not really what makes the whole factor. The whole thing here is that they were easily exposed. Let's say, well, probably the fact that they were lighter armored was definitely a factor. Most Celts didn't wear armor, just the elite did. But in here, I think it's really the combination javeliners plus terrain. So with javelins flying down from all these mountain tops, that really inflicted very heavy losses to the Galatians. And in fact, we think that in that case the Galatians were beaten almost solely by the Hellenic skirmishers. But that was a particular tactical theater, let's say, and the great usefulness, especially on a terrain like that, a mountainous one, was the chance of popping out from some narrow passage in the mountains in the rear of the enemy army, and that was normally, I mean, that was a nightmare already in open field. But in open field you could count, you know, usually at least you could, you had a better sight. You could see everywhere around. You could counter such maneuvers. But the in mountain passes it was all the more risky, because especially the Thermopylae are this kind of labyrinth of passages, of which all the battles that were fought at Thermopylae, historically speaking, we don't really know exactly where who passed from where. especially when the outflanking was performed, because there are many passages in there actually. The only thing in that case is that usually, if you leave the enemy no chance to flee, he will fight to the death. But it's still a pretty if you are able to surround the enemies, like checkmate, right? And and definitely the light infantry was very well suited for achieving such things. Also because at that point they could maybe they wouldn't engage in melee, but they would simply skirmish at close range against the heavily armored, or at least the main bulk of the formation that at that point was engaged into fight, and therefore wearing them down pretty quickly. And also because usually in infantry lines, especially at this point, the heavier guys were at the front. The rear lines were usually either put there to make mass, to make number, and they were the less reliable elements of the formation. So were on average also less armored. They were more they were less courageous probably also on average, and therefore skirmishing them and taking them out was easier than taking out the guys in the front. But still, the guys in the front needed the guys in the back. So that was a very good way to mess up the wall formation in practice, and to actually make morale collapse pretty suddenly. Another use that is said is of the Psiloi that is instead performed in open ground, was to support cavalry. There are many evidence throughout all history, I'd say, of infantry actually supporting actively, light infantry supporting actively cavalry into battle. And the reason of this was not just protecting cavalry. That usually was, cavalry has this problem that it cannot defend in practice. The weakness of cavalry is essentially that. So you would assist the cavalrymen even during the melee, probably, when especially the enemy cavalry was stopped, and in this sense it could be assaulted by guys on foot. But in this sense, light infantry was not conceived to counter enemy cavalry directly. They always acted as long as they were covered by their own cavalry. And the main function was to shoot at enemy cavalry in the meanwhile. So just imagine two cavalry formations that clash one against the other, and while they're clashing, you make skirmishers running at that and start hitting the enemy horses, either with javelins or maybe cutting the horses' guts with knives. And these were all things that were practically done. And also very effectively, because cavalry is also cavalry is the perfect target for missile infantry, because cavalry and horse and cavalrymen are pretty large targets. The especially the horse is usually unarmored at this time. Yes, the heavy cavalry had some form of protection, but generally speaking, like in all times in history, horse armor was extremely expensive, and only an elite could afford that practically. The Theban cavalry victory over the Athenians at Mantineia in 362, for instance, was attributed to the numbers and quality of the supporting light infantry. Just to say that the role of light infantry sometimes was crucial even in this, especially as an attrition factor, more than else. The Macedonians began to use especially the so-called Agrianes the Agranians were a population that inhabited the north of Greece. They were actually pretty skilled in this hit and run tactics. So Alexander made a great deal of use of such troops in his campaigns. And at the Battle of Granikos and Jaxartes, the Psiloi joined cavalry melees. So you can understand how effective they pretty were. The Agranians weren't really considered as something more elite, but let's say that the quality of light infantry in this sense can vary. You know, as we were saying, there were more or less warlike peoples, like the difference between essentially the civilized, we can use this term, and the tribal ones. So these Agranians were actually pretty useful, and you understand that if they had turned to be so effective into battle, you wouldn't like to lose them in quantity. You would like to preserve part of them, even if their role was still relatively their tactical role still exposed them to heavy casualties for obvious reasons. At the Battle of Gaugamela, there was a force that was concealed behind the Macedonian horsemen. We don't really know who they were. We all know they were Greeks, at least the sources called them in this way. They were actually probably these peltasts, that is skirmishers essentially, that and eventually charged out in support of the same cavalry. And this all belonged to a previous military teaching that we can still find even in Xenophon. Xenophon recommended, in fact, having a concealed force of behind cavalry to pop out at all of the sudden. If you think about later in Roman warfare, the Battle of Pharsalus, essentially Caesar did this. He concealed a bunch of legionaries behind one flank, and when the superior Pompey's cavalry, I think, beat his own cavalry on that flank, the legionaries popped out and defeated the. Actually, I think they immediately turned into rout the Pompeian cavalry, and basically Caesar won the battle in that fashion. So these were, now we're talking about Hellenistic warfare, but certain tactical functions actually remain always the same. Certain tricks are always out there in the practice of warfare, and they were pretty well known. I mean, sometimes we get to know such things, historically speaking, from, in fact, some sources that we prize very much, because we say, oh, this is the actual proof that this happened, aside from scanning evidence from the battles. Well, yeah, but there is not even need for that author to have written that, to know that there was a military know-how that was out there, that wasn't put into treatises or in histories, and that and that was definitely relying even on older knowledge, and it's always been so in history. As historians, we rely on these sources, but we have to make, especially military history, a certain military logics functioning, because we can't describe reality just for the scanning evidence that has arrived to us. Humans were always the same, so certain things never get old, and they were never young, probably, at least from a certain point onwards. And another important role in here was to support another type of cavalry, let's say. That is not really cavalry, it's elephantry, we can say. Because one use of the Psiloi was was being attached as elephant guards. Mm. The the are this actually happened also with partially with cavalry, meaning that cavalry could even could be even mixed with skirmishers. Um, there were certain occasions in which the skirmishers on foot could follow, for instance, skirmishers on horseback. Mm. The case of elephants is different because the elephants have a very peculiar tactical employment for which they're not so flexible as cavalry. Essentially, elephants have just to charge straight. They're very they have to be channeled in a certain sense towards that direction, and for this they need also to avoid them to run amok a guard, a defense, someone that is able to prevent further attacks on them. Because actually, I think historically speaking, the first evidence ever of light infantry attached to elephants for tactical use is in the Hellenistic armies proper. Even though this is also in here, it's just the first evidence that we have. I believe that those populations that made more extensive use of elephants, like the Indians, originally speaking, from which, by the way, many Hellenistic kingdoms were drawing their elephants at this time. There were also the African ones, but the African ones were a bit different. They were also present in less numbers. But what I mean is that India, where elephant warfare has always been a prominent feature of the local military traditions, probably had developed something of that kind. Even though, when you probably the role was a bit different, because one thing is to have an elephant in the West. That is something pretty rare. You don't want to you want to do everything in order to preserve that, because you have a very few numbers. It costs a lot. In India, instead, elephants were, I mean, they could throw them away. Usually, certain lots of hundreds of elephants were maybe given as even as diplomatic gifts, and there was really a great availability of these animals. So this might have actually triggered in the West a greater tactical attention for preserving the elephants compared to India. But this is just speculation. What is important, though, is that the best way to kill an elephant, actually the only way to take him out, this is what the Romans had to learn during the Punic Wars and before against Pyrrhus, is to stab them in the rear end, literally. I mean, that's the only soft spot of the elephant, basically, and in order to do so, you have to have the guts to come around the elephant. That is usually, by the way, a rageous one that can take you and smash you to the ground or do the worst imaginable things. And all this usually, in fact, with other guys that are there, other guys, I mean humans, that prevent you actively from getting around. So, even though battles never turned actually into this completely and absurd things that we see in movies, like a completely chaotic melee in which there is no formation and nothing, we still have to think that on many occasions, especially these small tactical units that had this very specific tasks, could definitely get in through the enemy lines. The situation got pretty disordered and all. On my video on the Battle of Ilipa, I think I touched this, because at a certain point the Romans have to outflank the Carthaginian wings and to start hitting the elephants. It was probably something very complicated to achieve, and also very frightening, because and especially you don't always have the chance of doing that. Sometimes you have no other option but being charged by the elephant, so you have to invent other things, like the Romans did at Zama, that was essentially open a gap during between the legions, and letting the elephant pass through these corridors. And but just for saying that, the presence of guards around the enemy, around the elephants, were pretty were there for a reason. And even the idea of countering, so you would take out the elephants usually with your skirmishers, because they're expandables, and against elephants you necessarily have to send expandables, because the worst way you can do is to expose your elite to elephants, because those are going to be wiped out as much as skirmishers by an elephant charge, for the sheer mass of the elephant. So basically, around the elephants in ancient warfare, you probably found skirmishers fighting against skirmishers, and that is a very effective way to deal with the situation. Without counting that, elephants had sometimes skirmishers even on their hump, so they were actively guys that were shooting you from the above, from over the elephant at whoever approached. I made a video about the Mogul elephants, armored elephants, in which I explain also the kind of psychological devastating task of getting around an elephant into battle. But this definitely happened, and also the effort to keep the other other people out of there from the elephant itself. And actually the number of Psiloi that were deployed for each elephant could be very high. I mean, several tens even. So the idea is that there was definitely a lot of care for these beasts. And by the way, they would also help the elephant charge on some occasion. I mean, maybe they were even sent to skirmish, maybe to already soften up the enemy ranks before the actual elephant charge, so that, or maybe paving the road of the elephant in the same moment in which they were charging, so that would maximize the effect of the enemy on the enemy ranks in terms of this disruption and all. We talked about mountain warfare before, and the Psiloi, as we were saying, were really useful in here. Passes, fortified positions, or at least top hills and very difficult ground to reach were definitely the best place where to deploy them, and let the best of your troops to instead to be on the move. Many people say, well, a reason as if putting an elite force in defense was something good. I mean, yeah, it can happen. There are definitely tactical situations in which that is useful. But when you have the favor of gravity, you can also add, let's say, you can also let relatively weak troops to maintain that position, because it's very difficult. It's very easily defendable. So you can free essentially. You can deploy better troops in more effective tactical roles than that. Usually the best way to take these positions was to outflank them, because frontally speaking, usually it was impossible. Obviously these positions were chosen for the advantages that they could offer in some measure. Once again, at the Thermopylae pass, the Macedonian general Cassandras, finding the Aetolians blocking the coastal pass, basically blocking the pass, he simply built rafts and sailed his army past. So that was a way that it's not that you can do every time. So that actually shows, if anything, how impregnable certain positions practically were, even if they were controlled by lighter troops, and how effective in this sense the position was. How well fitting the role of such troops was for such a position. And Alexander also had a great deal of mountain warfare, especially in the Middle East. And even in here, where first of all, we must say the same phalanx turned out to be extremely effective even on mountain passes. Like Alexander's phalanges on these occasions obviously were in greater difficulty than in open ground, but they could transform themselves even into assault troops and all, especially the picked bodies of the guards and stuff like that. But it's on this strategic theater that the archers and the Agrianes were actually the of better use, probably. Especially missile troops were very good at creating suppressing fire on the strongholds, on the strongholds walls. Either were forts or citadels, stuff like that. So this was a way to drive off, the enemy missile, and this doesn't work every time. But that's where it makes the difference to have consistent numbers of Psiloi in this sense. The regular use that Alexander made of these troops was usually to outflank the enemy or to attack to support infantry or cavalry in the process. Another very good thing that skirmishers could do really was to attack enemy camps at night. This happened also in basically all times in history. The advantage is that at night, usually you don't know what the hell is going on. Like with darkness, you have no idea of who is attacking you, first of all, whereas the whole enemy army is just skirmishers. And so you usually don't sail out, also because usually a night attack causes an immediate chaos in terms of fear. With the darkness, even human instincts are more irrational in many ways. So in that case, these skirmishers could really make raining javelins into the enemy camps, maybe even using fire, so that hoping to set on fire certain camps, because in daylight, especially if those guys were only skirmishers, as it was often the case, the enemy cavalry could have sailed off the camp and pursue and essentially butcher down the skirmishers, which was a very easy thing to do for cavalry, especially in open ground. But at night, as we were saying, it's all another story. So these attacks were often done, especially to tire and to stress out the enemy before the following day's battle was effectively done. this was done, for instance, by Antiochus the third against the I don't remember his name, but he was the rebel of Babylon, of the Babylonia region that the satrap he had gone against. So these were all tricks that, as we said, were known, but you needed definitely skirmishers to carry out. So the skirmisher, in this sense, is really the unsung, say, hero. I don't like the word hero, generally speaking, but the term unsung hero renders the idea of what I'm talking about, because everybody celebrated the Phalanx, the cavalry, and this. But objectively, these guys had probably the worst jobs of all, and nobody cared about them. They were considered expendable, nobody wrote about them. They were usually mercenaries, that is, foreigners most of the times. Most of the times, in this sense, also barbarians from the, say, at least the Hellenic and partly the Hellenistic mindset. So there were people who were treated even less, they were thought less of. But that, telling the truth, greatly helped the whole thing going on. You couldn't carry out a campaign effectively again without these guys. And what you actually see is that in Hellenistic military history, that there was a revival, especially towards the end, before that the Romans came and and they unplugged, let's say, the situation. Of increasing amount increasingly an increasing use of light infantry, and this is very important also for another reason, that is that Hellenistic armies had this Macedonian style phalanx that was, I mean, usually not really all Hellenistic powers could field in the first place an Hellenistic a Macedonian phalanx, but aside from this, the great problems of the phalanx, around which it's been written and said so much, was actually the inflexibility of this formation. So the idea that the phalanx required a lot of time to deploy, it needed to remain compact to be effective, and therefore on uneven ground, it was prone to disrupt. We have even evidence of this, but telling the truth, we have also evidence of the contrary, in the sense that sometimes in very tough terrain the phalanx held formation. Or maybe there was no one from the other side that had enough skill to actually exploit the gaps of the formation. But actually, I'm one of those people who has a less mechanicistic idea of why, relatively to the phalanx cohesion on tough ground, and it's a bit more complicated than what is usually told. One day I will have to do the video that is the problem of the phalanx, and because even in here lots been said, but very few actually is still got right. I mean, modern people have certain prejudices that they can't get rid of in any way, and I would like to make some, let's say, to make some some clarifications, let's say, on the subject matter. But the point is that actually towards the end of the Hellenistic age, we see essentially certain phalanxes that were growing increasingly synergic together with lighter infantry. And especially if you think about Philip V, the Macedon, he was great. He made great use of such and profitable use of such skirmishers, so that these would really compensate that alleged inflexibility that the phalanx actually had. Also in here it's a bit complicated because we have it's not the case of Philip V, but there is evidence of even a line of battle made up of parts of phalanx and parts of lighter infantry to give a bit more flexibility that is also something that should be reflected about. But let's say that the typical role of skirmishers was being enhanced towards the end of the Hellenistic era, and thanks to the Psiloi and other this generic term, then we can say the Agrianes, especially for the Antigonid armies, were being increasingly better used. And even on very difficult terrain, these Macedonian armies were increasingly more effective, especially from a strategical point of view, that tactically speaking too, in part. But probably it was a transformation in Hellenistic warfare that was cut off in the bud by the Romans at that point. However, then, relatively to the Psiloi, in conclusion, other roles were definitely scouting, protecting heavy troops on the march, as we were saying right now, keeping off even skirmishing cavalry. This is something, usually skirmishing cavalry was good against foot skirmishers on average, but it still suffered enough losses. So probably the best cavalry you could use to wipe out skirmishers was the medium one, because it didn't commit the very elite that was conceived for very other specific tactical roles. So could wipe out consistently the skirmishers, even if in there with some slight loss. Another thing, as we've seen, was taking down elephants as well, together with escorting them, and chariots, because chariots were very difficult. You can make scare horses. The chariots chariots still existed out there, even if the war chariot era was practically over. The chariots were used at this point in increasing in size in practice, so that it wasn't really much about the original tactical flexibility of chariots, but really the idea that at this point the chariot had transformed essentially as a very heavy sheathed thing that you had to throw against infantry and to scare, hopefully. But hitting at the chariots was pretty useful. At the Battle of Magnesia, actually, there were horse skirmishers in the Talid contingent in the Roman army that knocked out the Seleucid chariots by hitting at the horses that incidentally turn around and impacted against the Seleucid flank itself. So it was even there. It was dangerous even to use chariots and elephants, and definitely javelins were some of the best weapons you could employ against such troops. Psiloi could guard flanks. They were also pretty good, as we've said. They were trained usually to go on harsh terrain, and as such they could also carry out forced marches. They knew how to move speedily. They could outflank the enemy, make feigned retreats. This was also done, especially this was preferably done by cavalry, but even infantry could do that. And ambushes, naturally. Ambushing is, probably the chief troop for ambushing is light skirmishers, definitely. There was some usage even of light infantry of this kind in sometimes in the battle line, and it didn't happen often. It either happened because either to fill gaps usually, but sometimes it could be done really because that's all you had in some measure, at least for the flanks. The Battle of Raphia, for instance, between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. So actually I think from both sides the deployment of Psiloi on the flanks of, not really on the flanks of the battle line, but let's say on the right and left extremes of the battle line itself. The then flanks had cavalry, were covered by cavalry. So, and this usually didn't turn out very well, because light infantry is not supposed to be battle line. At least there is some light infantry that can serve that, but the Psiloi were like the lightest of the lightest. They were skirmishers and practically not even, yeah, still infantry, but it's kind of as if there was a differentiation between melee infantry and skirmishers. And then in every condition, these guys, especially when they were fighting on, I don't know, in forests against other skirmishers, they could definitely engage into melee. They had swords and stuff like that, together with the javelins and all. And the javelin could be used as a spear as well. So there would be a lot more to say about Psiloi, but I think we can't stop for today. I'm not gonna discuss the equipment now, also because we partially covered it, conceptually speaking. I will come back on these things also because when you discuss, broadly speaking, about armies, you always end up in considering every tactical unit that is essentially making them up. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested about my upcoming videos. And for now, thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye!